So as I mentioned, I'm Irene Allen, and I'm the director here at the Institute for Classics Education. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, and our mission is to provide free resources and support for educators who teach Homer and ancient Greek texts in English translation. We strive also to provide a Greek context on ancient Greek texts for anyone who wishes to learn more about them. In addition to hour-long seminars like this one, we also run 12-week courses on the Iliad in the fall and the Odyssey in the spring, and we do develop new courses by request. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions about our programs or you would like to request a program. I will put my email and our website in the chat. Today, we're going to be doing something we don't do very, very often, which is a topic on Latin literature. And I'm very happy and excited to welcome Hilary Yip for this talk today. Hilary is a Y13 G12 student in Hong Kong who will be studying classics at university in the fall. Hilary has been studying Latin for the past 5 years now, has studied Virgil for the past 3, and is currently working on a project to translate the Aeneid with interlinear and scansions, and has been known to skip to favorite passages. Hilary has been examined on the Aeneid on IGCSE, AP, A-level classical studies, and in studies of A-level Latin. You can also find Hilary's thoughts on the Aeneid in Antigone Journal. I'll put a link for that in the chat as well. And Hilary's artwork is featured in the Institute shop, which I will also include a link to. So please welcome Hilary, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really grateful for this, and of course for the classes that I've been attending with you since last September. So I'm very happy to be here. Okay, so today's presentation will be on the underworld translations of the Aeneid. So just with the title, something quick to note about Latin is just that the word order can shift as you wish. So arma vidumque trafero, which means arms in the manner translate, and just switching the first couple words around, you can technically reorganize it in any way you'd like. So just virumque here is an enclitic, so you can have ands attached to the ends of words. So it's just important to keep in mind going to this, how flexible Latin is as a language. So just a quick note on the Aeneid to start with. It's an epic poem by Virgil, which has 12 books. It was designed to be a national epic as part of the Augustan program when Augustus took power as the first emperor, and therefore it has some propagandistic elements. This is really obvious in some places where you've got like, in book 1, you've got an epic simile where it's about a riotous mob that's calmed by a just and honest man, which isn't very subtle in my opinion, and different parts about Augustus coming up at various parts of the book. This is also, most importantly, a Latin creation. So as you might know from the words of Virgil and a couple of other Latin prose and verse artists at that point, there's an element of just self-doubt with the Latin language, which is why Cicero tried to translate philosophy from Greek into Latin, and why Virgil's work was hailed as such an important text, because this crucially made the epic tradition, which was Greek, something to do with Latin. And that's why it really matters. Finally, this builds on existing mythology. So Aeneas obviously turns up in the Iliad a couple times, but this expands on what happens afterwards. So while we don't know very much about how Aeneas was perceived before Virgil, there are some suggestions that he was part of the mythology surrounding Rome, and there are some questions about how he was portrayed. And there are suggestions that he might have been initially perceived as a bit of a coward. I personally think that Aeneas is a bit of a wimp, but he is the hero of this epic and my absolute favorite epic. So book six is what we're focusing on. And this is just a couple of main plot points. At this point in the story, Aeneas has heard a prophecy that says that he must go down to the underworld to meet his father. And after he achieves the golden bough from inside the forest, he is able to descend into the underworld with the Sibyl as his guide. And in there, he reaches Anchises. He tells him about what the future of Rome will be, and Aeneas goes back to rejoin his men at the end of the book. So the two translators we're going to look at today will be Shady Barsht and Seamus Heaney. And this is just a quick way to take a look at what their thoughts were about the translations and to just consider what their goals were. And that's crucially different. So here she mentions the difficulties of the language in Latin because it doesn't have a definite article. For those of you who know Greek, this is quite different. And it means that Latin can be a lot more condensed than English, which means that it's just a lot more flexible what can happen. She specifically says that she wants to create something as close to the original as possible, which is something that that translators can do sometimes. Emily Wilson's versions of the Odyssey and the bit of the Iliad that I saw in one of her presentations, she does take a lot of liberties with the poem, which I think stretches it almost into the point where it's a new version. But it is important to note that when you translate, there are interpretations that you then impose upon it. She says that she tries to keep it as close to the Latin as possible and to keep it to line numbers, which is really quite important because when you're studying any text, it's important to track where you are at. And sometimes when you switch the line numbers, it can get quite confusing. The biggest example of this is Robert Fagles with his translations of the Iliad and Odyssey, where things can get pretty offline. And it does take a bit of work to try and guess where it was in the original version. So here's quite interesting because she talks about how meter matters. And dactylic hexameter, which is how the Iliad, Aeneid, and Odyssey were written, are a pretty formulaic set of verse, which you can't really replicate in English. So sometimes in Virgil, you'll notice that verbs turn up earlier than they should be, or that you get condensed words with elision. And that's not something you can do in English. So that's why quite a lot of translators have more trouble trying to come across with that sense of rhythm in English. So Seamus Heaney is a lot more artistic about his translation. And he says that this is more of a way to be a memorial to his teacher back in the day. He also, his introduction is really worth reading. It's very pretty. And he says that this is partly to honor his granddaughter, who you mentioned is a new soul who comes down from the underworld after 1,000 years of waiting, as Virgil suggests in book 6. So here is quite interesting because he mentions his explicit purpose is to try and work out what is true to Virgil. And this is, to me, very important because it matches the difference between what's true to the Latin and what's true to the poetry. And that's why I think that his translation of book 6 is such a wonderful work of art. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into hell. So the way I'm going to do this is to show you a bit of the Latin first, and we can just take a look at a few lines, see what's cool, and then we can go into what's unique about Latin and how do the translators approach it. So here I have the arrows indicate where adjectives go with the different nouns. And on the other side, the squiggles indicate scansion. I'm not going to claim to be the best with rhythm. Anyone who knows me well knows that I've got a bit of a tin ear, but this scansion is accurate. So this starts with an invocation to the underworld gods, where the speaker asks for permission to spread the things in the deep earth. Because the underworld is, quite a scary thing, this seeks divine permission and marks a shift in tone from what happens just before this, when the Sibyl calls out to Aeneas and tells him to take heart and to enter into the cave. So if we were to just read the first line metrically to give you an idea of how it goes, it'll be Di quipusim periest anima rumbrae quesilentes. So as you can tell, there's a clear lilt there, and it sort of matches, it's very chanty, which is accurate to what's going on. A note is just that when you see free, dactyls or spondies, dactyls being long, short, short, because it matches the finger. So if you look at your finger, this is a long, this is a short, short. So that's how you can always tell if it's a dactyl or spondee. A heavily dactylic line is meant to be a lot faster, whereas a spondaic line is a lot slower. So that's just something to keep in mind when you see a lot of them in a line. The final 2 feet are always going to be a dactyl followed by a spondy, although the final one can be a long short, or something that, if it's unfinished, could end a bit differently. Here, everything is roughly equal, so it's not going to be a big deal. So what's interesting in the Latin, you get something with interlocking word order, which is technically called synchesis. With res alta here, res alta terra e cangignem essas. And this is interesting because it creates this burial effect, because this is about things in the deep earth and darkness. If you think of it as a prepositional phrase, it sort of has this interlocking order where, with it going back and forth, shows you in the grammar how things are literally being hidden. And that's a really cool effect that you can get in the Latin. Another thing is the polyptoton with maligna and Silnis. Here, maligna and Silvis being just words that have spiteful, and Silvis being having wood-like elements. And that repeating itself is pretty cool and just gives you a suggestion of the woods that they're in. Finally, you'll notice here a little comment on the meter, where you have a more dactylic line, which creates fear and panic. And as they go into the underworld with ibant obscuris sova sub nocte perumbram, it really slows down. So you get a sense of the dread, and you get the sense of rhythm as they march into the underworld, which is just so cool. Now, just looking at this, you can tell that there's quite a lot going on in the Latin. And this is just a tiny little bit about what can happen. So you really do sort of feel sorry for anybody who's trying to translate this into English, because there are all these factors you need to consider. And I think that both translators do a really good job. So this is what I'm going to just give you guys a minute to just read through quickly. And just to offer a couple of notes. First, on first glance, Haney's translation is quite a bit longer. He can be true to the line number sometimes, but crucially, because his is targeted for artistry, this isn't a key focus, whereas Barsh is pretty strict with keeping the line numbers in most places. Just to give you guys a minute. Okay, so if we were to get back into it now, what's interesting is that how they handle the invocations. So in Barsh, what she leaves out is by your divine permission. So numen, it's the numina in the Latin that's slightly earlier. She leaves it out here, but she does keep it the fast, let it be right, which is interesting because it modifies the invocation slightly. Whereas Haney does keep this with let ascent be forthcoming, although he doesn't quite refer to the power in the same way. By leaving it out, I think that they both do it to fit the meter, but it is important to note that there is a bigger acknowledgement of the power of the gods that doesn't quite come through. Another thing that's interesting is how Haney riffs on the description of the underworld with these phantasmal reaches as he gets inside. This doesn't really happen in the Latin, but it does have this sound effect that comes through, because you can't quite mimic it, but when you read it, this comes through in English as much more grandiose in a way. And it does show you the stateliness of the Latin verse. Finally, another thing that they both don't do is the way they translate absolute. So in the final lines, Black night leaches color from the world, or while the colors of the world pall in the gloom. What they don't translate is what the literal Latin says, which is Black night stealing color from the world. It doesn't quite capture that sense of aggressiveness that Virgil does have, which I think doesn't create the same atmosphere as the Latin, but I do understand why they do this, because it preserves the horror for the next part when you see the monsters. To move on to the next part, if this works. Okay. So vestibulum ante primum primisque in falcibus orci. So here they entered the underworld and they get to see all these different personified versions of concepts that manifest as monsters here. So what's interesting is that note how many arrows you see and how far some of them can go. This shows you again how flexible Latin can be, because you can have things intersect, or in 280 and 281, how things can go backwards and refer to things in previous lines. It's important, especially when reading this, to keep a close eye on what goes where, and it's quite easy to lose track of what's going on. This is important and quite artistic because it shows you the chaos of the underworld. So at this point, Aeneas and the Sibyl are just in what's envisioned as sort of a garden inside hell, like this courtyard. And seeing all of these monsters is obviously frightening and chaotic. And the way the Latin works here by making it so just scattershot, it's just very good at showing you the fear and just confusion and just the overwhelming nature of the underworld. So you'll notice that quite a lot of lines here are quite dactylic. So this is a generally very fast section. So et metuset mangesuata fa mesactur pistegestas. Here you can just see how things are speeding up. You can hear quite a lot of sibilants. You can see a lot of repeating sounds, which just show you a bit more chaos. To go more carefully, the polysyndeton is referenced in all the quers and ets, which are ands, and it's just to create a listing effect and more panic as you go through the list. For meter, you'll notice that some lines can be more spondaic, which when it happens, it's more of to slow things down in order to keep an eye on just the fear. So 273, this is as they first go in. So if we were to just slow it down, vestibulantipsum primisquin falcibus orcis. So even in English, when you slow things down to that extent, it shows you just profound dread, and I think that's pretty cool. And this is how I just handle it. I'll give you guys a minute. Okay, so what's interesting is again how both of them handle the length of the passage. So Aeneid stretches it out a little bit more, whereas Barsh keeps it quite short. And what's interesting is how both of them tend to approach the way these monsters are acting. So in the Latin, you have either just participles or one main verb that's going on, whereas in which Barth captures really well, but Haney ends up being a little bit more creative here and has them acting more actively in the grammar than it does in the Latin. She also Barsh also does something quite interesting with how mad discord is being portrayed. So serpent hair bound up with bloody ribbons is just really accurate to the Latin, but the pity is that neither of them are able to have the same sort of sibilants that come out in the meter that does happen in Virgil. So Haney here has a really pretty version of the Latin. So he does it and creates a lot more drama here, which is very important to maintaining the atmosphere of the underworld. He also is a little bit more creative with the order of the monsters. The most interesting example of this is death-dealing war, which in the Latin comes slightly earlier. And I think that his version here is a little bit more effective than Barsh because it's more emphatic and it's just a lot more visceral than what she has. Not to pit them against each other too much. These are both brilliant translations. Okay, so next part. This is one of the coolest parts of book 6, where you have the tree. And this is a hoary oak in the middle with these false dreams lingering beneath each leaf. It's it's really important to note that this you'll see all the dactyls in line 284, and this speeding up sort of has this susurration effect where you can just feel all the enormity of the dreams underneath the leaves. Furthermore, it's interesting to just take a look at how this giant modifies both of these, and to consider how and to consider just the order of the words here. If we were to go to, and then she carries on by having, by listing more monsters. The purpose of just having the tree in the middle, which Virgil does again later, is to create this moment of calm, where amid the chaos, there's something to center it, or something that is just different to focus on. This breaks up the listing and just makes it more effective. You'll see this later with the double epic simile. The hyperlage that happens with foliis quo sub omnibus means that it just changes the order from what's expected. So sub omnibus foliis would make a bit more sense inside a normal prepositional phrase, but changing it, A, helps meter, and B, just refocuses the reader's attention. So, for example, if we think about in English, how we might have, she is running quickly. So quickly running might change up what your expectations are and just draws more attention to the phrase in question. There are also just quite a bit of interlocking word order, which creates this effect where it just causes more chaos, and it's quite pretty. So, but here, what's interesting is that Aeneid is a bit more brief, and this marks a pattern that carries on for the rest of this passage, which is quite interesting because he gets a little bit stricter, whereas Barsh becomes a little bit more flexible. He's also a bit more literal here because he mentions the stabling by the doors, which is the exact verb in Latin, whereas Barsh has brooding in pens, which is a bit more flexible, but is pretty cool. Furthermore, they do change the way the listing happens. Aeneid changes the polysyndeton to asyndeton by having commas instead of ands. Both of these still maintain the listing effect, but it is interesting that he does change the style. In addition, darkly aflutter from Barsh here in line 2 of her translation is an interesting translation because it doesn't come across in the Latin exactly, but it does create the susurrating effect that you do have in the Latin about how the leaves are moving. Okay, so more monsters. So here you've got the chimera, the gorgons, harpies, and the shape of the free-bodied shade, which is always just difficult to say. And this is pretty cool, especially when Aeneas gets into the picture, because this marks a pattern where Aeneas just goes absent for a while. Like the beginning of the Aeneid itself, it just has this big episode before Aeneas comes in as pretty much a drowned rat inside the middle of the ocean. And he tends to be out of action for just a little bit before he comes in, usually doing something a bit pathetic, in this case, striking shadows of his sword. And here, what's interesting is to see how the shades are being described. So, volitare cava sub imagine formae and tenuis sine corporis vitas. So 292, if we look at the tenuis and vitas with sine corpora in the middle, this has this embodying effect almost, where it's feeble lives without bodies. With having that separated in the middle, it does create grammatically that separation from the body. And that's something that is just pretty cool. You'll also notice the dactyls in that line. So, et ni docta comes tenuis sine corpora vitas oneat vomitare cava sub imagine formae. The speeding up here shows you the flitting of the souls, and it's just how meter and the syntax both play such a large role in creating the drama and the fear in the underworld. So here, where you have Aeneas actually acting, so it's ingruat et frustro ferro diveberet umbras. So here it's also quite interesting because you'll notice that the verb is sort of postponed to the end, and ammoniat is like subjunctive, so it's not part of the main clause. It's just really separated from Aeneas in 291, which shows you just how things are happening in the middle, and Aeneas is just really confused by this terror around him. So the ACI is a grammatical concept, so it's like that something or the other. It's quite emphatic and creates this effect where it's just suddenly shifting the attention a little bit. So the way the verbs can come significantly before or after just shows the flexibility of the language. So for example, Cicero was notorious for moving his verbs to the very, very end of sentences and can be a bit confusing for that reason. So let's see how our translators handle this. If anyone needs a little bit more time to read, just please let me know, because I do have a tendency of reading a little bit quickly. So if I'm speaking too fast, please just drop a message and I'll slow down. Sorry. Okay, so to get into it, here the pattern continues where Haney is a little bit more succinct and just a little bit more literal than Barsh, where she really does start to become more artistic. The best example of this is when she describes the shades in question, that these were light without substance, phantoms, apparitional forms. This creates a trichoman of sorts, which isn't really there in the Latin, but I think that the way she does this by having that stretch across two lines does create that sense of chaos where it's not literal, sure, but I think that it captures the Latin really well and is pretty cool. Both of them also don't quite get the prepositional phrase about something being beneath literal forms, which I think doesn't, which is a pity, but I also get how that might be confusing in the English, because the shades in the underworld are crucially meant to be pretty tragic, because either they're being stuck on the shore for 1,000 years, or when Aeneas does see his father, that he can't embrace him as he wants to. And that section is both really sad and also just really worth reading because it's absolutely so beautiful. Furthermore, it's just noting the line number, and with the monsters, the final monsters here, it's how they switch from that into Aeneas's actions. So you'll notice that both of them have Aeneas slightly further up than in the Latin, where it's immediately Aeneas shook with sudden fear, whereas the shaking with Aeneas coming down later. Obviously, this is due to the limits of English, but it's just interesting to note. And it's also interesting to note the pattern of Aeneas just being afraid. Okay, so here is a section where we get to see more of the underworld, and we're heading out from the hypothetical courtyard and down into the geography of it. So one way the underworld has been imagined in the past by people reading the Aeneid is that when he goes in, it's more of like a stereotypical villa, and he's just in the courtyard of it with just like a big palace. He's just there. And this is the point at which he's exiting the villa and seeing the streams on the other side. So here it's just, what's interesting is 295 and 297, the belching and just the sort of the weird qualities of the water, where you have the whirlpool with vast mud, and you'll notice the arrows here again have a similar effect where it's just this mixing effect. And you have the belching of the sand and the boiling. It's just not a happy river. The ferryman is then described as unkempt with all the arrows going around. You'll notice that it's again quite a chaotic scene. And what's quite interesting is line 304, where his immortality is being pointed to. He is now old, but old age is hardy and green to a god like him. With the arrow effect again, it adds emphasis to it, and it's something that's quite cool. 295 in the scansion, you'll notice that Hinkwia, that line is again really fast. So you have a sense of just acceleration down to the river. And here, when you get the more dactylic lines, you get more of the swirling sense where you get the boiling of the river more clearly. The glottals also show the splattering of the splattering of the water, because it's just this unpleasant like swamp texture. And the Omnuharenam is separated again, where you get 297, and that again just shows more chaos. Now to move on to translations. Okay, it's worth noticing again that Barsh does extend her lines a little bit. Most notably with the very end, old but still God, and in God old age is green and hardy. The repetition there does add more emphasis to what's being described, like the Latin does, but I think that the repetition does stretch it out a little bit more, and the line numbers do become a little bit confusing at this point of her translation. They're both relatively literal with the translation and the grammar, but it is noteworthy how they tend to make it just add this flourish in English, because as much as I love being literal about it, there is the problem of translationese. Like if you read slightly older versions of the classical library, you can get some really odd phrasings, which you do need Latin in order to decipher the English. So just to look at a couple ways they change things. And you have heaving with mud, venting a silty upsurge into cocytus. That's just really pretty. Wait, did someone say something? Did someone say anything? If there are any questions. Oh, cat running off across computer. It happens. I made sure to put out my cat like 5 minutes before this started. Her name's Hera, and much like Juno in the Aeneid, she would have absolutely tried to rain havoc over this. Okay. Always beware the gods, especially when they're cats. So another thing that was quite interesting about the way Charon was described was his eyes being set in and just shining. So go back to the Latin slightly earlier on. You'll notice here that stant lumina flamma, and it's just a very curious way to describe his eyes, which draws emphasis to just the way it's shining in the dark, and it just gives the implication that it's like this flame in there, that's instead of an eye, you just have a spark of fire. And both these translators have this they don't quite have that flaming eye thing, but I do really like the way Haney has it described as staring fixed and fierce, which is just real cool. And oh, this is also interesting because some people point to this as an example of polychromy and the importance of color in the ancient world, where it's I recommend just looking that up afterwards. And it's just important to remember that the ancient world was full of color, and it's just something to bear in mind as well. So the this eye stand in his head and glow is how Barsh captures it, and I think that that's really well executed. So move on to the next part where we get to see the shades on the river, and this is the coolest part of the Aeneid, in my opinion. So here what we have is the double epic simile from Quam multa in silvis autumni frigor primo. What's interesting is how it just cuts into the previous description of the people on the edge. So here we have mothers and men. The ended bodies and lives of great soul heroes, unmarried girls and boys, young men laid on pyres before the eyes of their parents. What's interesting here is just the way they're being listed, and it's just increasing levels of pathos where we learn about the victims and who these souls were. And this is meant to be a really poignant scene. You do get the listing effect where it's quite quick because you get the sense of just the crowd on the edge. You'll also notice fewer arrows here because the idea isn't to create chaos, but the idea is just to lay out a clear list. And 309 is just very abrupt as he switches. And you'll notice that immediately switches from very heavy on the dactyls to being very spontaneous. So we suddenly get a really slow, just as in the forest, the first frost of autumn, you'll get this just slowing down effect, which immediately shifts the tone and creates a very pretty contrast to it. So just as the leaves drop and fall, lapsa calumfolia, you'll notice that you have you'll have the foliage being affected by two words. It just carries on the idea of something falling. And you'll also get this sound effect in the scansion part of things, where you do get, so you do have this mimicking sound effect in the Latin. And then it switches again quite abruptly into the birds as they flee from the chill of the year and then into sunny lands. So aprikis teris, which is just lovely. So aprikis just means sunny or summery, and it's just describing the migration of birds. And just from there, you get this abrupt switch back into the underworld. So stabant orantes primi. So you get from this really pretty nature scene into these souls begging to be transported and just stretching their hands out, wishing to be taken across to whatever's next. So you get the sibilants in 311, which is like susurrations, and the T's mimic twittering of the birds. And it's just lamentation with the I in 307. So animum heroum inuptaeque puellae, you get the sense of lamentation and just mourning in the Latin. And now to move on to how they translate. So here they're both really literal, the stream of bodies, although the way they translate heroes is quite interesting. So noble-minded heroes, it's more of them great-souled, which I get it, but it doesn't quite capture the same essence of the Latin. Or the lifeless bodies of brave heroes also doesn't quite capture the great-souled nature of them. Barthes makes an interesting decision with before the father's eyes, because the Latin is quite explicitly before the parents' eyes, and there isn't necessarily a gender being assigned to it. I suspect this is because you have the mothers being mentioned slightly earlier, but it's just worth noting that she does make this change, and I can't quite work out why that's the case. The double epic simile is handled very well by both of them, although aprikis teris is better translated in Aeneid with sunny lands, whereas countries in the sun in Barthes is a lot more wordy, and I don't think captures the sense as well. What's also worth noting is the transition in and out of the similes, which Aeneid does quite abruptly, which is the same as the Latin, whereas Barthes has more of a clear transition in and out, which I think doesn't quite have the same sense, but I do understand how this fits more of the structure that she wants to impose on the Latin. So here, my section ends here, and here's the painting of pretty much the same scene we've just covered, from going from the monsters down into the underworld as he sees all the souls. Thank you so much. If you're interested in learning more about Latin, here are a couple of interesting resources to check out. And if you enjoyed the text in question, here are a couple of recommendations of what might be cool to check out. These are specifically Latin stuff, although absolutely read the Iliad and Odyssey if you haven't already. If anyone has any questions, my email's here. And to see what I'm doing with more Latin stuff, or if for my other classics projects, my Twitter is where I tend to update things. Thank you so much. If anyone has any questions, you're more than free to ask. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hillary. That was really interesting. And I'm going to stop the recording now so that we can take questions.